My dad took my $330K without asking, then came back acting like I owed him more. That's the headline, right? The clickbait. But the truth is, it was more than just the money, though the money was the lightning rod that finally cracked the whole rotten structure of our family wide open. It started with a single audacious move. He saw my savings account balance online, a number I'd painstakingly built over years of ramen dinners and skipped vacations, and just helped himself. No call, no text, no, "Honey, I'm having a bit of a situation." Nothing. Just a transfer, clean and silent, from my account to his. $330,000. Gone. Vanished like smoke. I remember staring at my phone, the banking app glowing obscenely in the dim light of my studio apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. It wasn't even a loan, not in his mind. It was an advance, a preemptive strike against an imagined future debt I supposedly owed him for, well, for everything, I guess. For giving me life, for the roof over my head when I was a kid, for the privileged upbringing he'd always reminded us we had, even when things were tight. And he didn't just take it. He took it to prop up a failing business venture that he'd sunk his own considerable fortune into, a venture my mother had begged him to abandon for years. When I finally confronted him, not in person, not yet, but a furious, tear-soaked email that I immediately regretted sending, his response was dismissive. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah," he typed back, his words a casual balm on a gaping wound. "It's just money. You'll make it back. Besides, you were always the responsible one. I knew you'd understand." Understand? I didn't understand anything anymore. Not how my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who cheered loudest at my graduation, could so casually plunder my future. My mother, bless her perpetually anxious soul, had tried to mediate. She'd called me, her voice tight with a fear I'd heard 1,000 times before, the fear of upsetting him, the fear of disruption. "Sarah, honey, your father is under a lot of stress," she'd whispered, the words a worn-out lullaby. "This new venture, it's so important to him. He said he needed to get it off the ground before the end of the quarter. He didn't mean to worry you." I could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air between us. Don't make him angry. Just let it go. Letting it go was what I always did. I was the peacekeeper, the dutiful daughter, while my older brother, Mark, was the golden boy, the one who inherited Dad's swagger and his business acumen. I was the quiet one, the one who aced her exams, got the scholarship, and landed a good job at a reputable law firm right out of college. I'd learned early on that my perceived stability and quiet competence were a sort of currency in our family. I was the one who could be counted on, the one who wouldn't cause a fuss. My quiet life, the one I'd meticulously built brick by brick, suddenly felt like a flimsy facade. The $330,000 wasn't just savings. It was my safety net, my ticket to a down payment on a small condo, my escape route from the city's insane rent prices. It was the tangible proof that I was capable, that I could stand on my own 2 feet, independent of the sprawling, increasingly precarious empire my father had built. The real sting wasn't just the theft. It was the subsequent paternalistic condescension. He didn't just steal my money. He stole my agency. He acted as if my financial independence was some sort of juvenile extravagance, a plaything I'd grow out of. It was as if he saw my hard-earned savings not as a reflection of my diligence and sacrifice, but as some frivolous allowance he was entitled to dip into. He was the patriarch, the provider, and I, his adult daughter, was still somehow a child in his eyes, incapable of managing my own affairs responsibly. This wasn't the first time he'd exerted control, of course. There was the time he'd subtly derailed my first serious relationship, a kind, artistic guy he deemed not ambitious enough, making veiled comments about financial futures and career trajectories, until I felt so guilty and inadequate that I ended it myself. Or the way he'd always steered my career choices, nudging me towards stable professions like law, while subtly dismissing my early interest in creative writing as a hobby. He wasn't overtly cruel, not in the way you'd see in a soap opera. His methods were far more insidious. They were the slow drip of doubt, the constant undercurrent of disapproval disguised as concern, the well-intentioned advice that always seemed to lead back to his own vision of my life should be. The family Thanksgiving that year was a masterclass in passive aggression. I'd driven up from the city, the drive filled with a gnawing anxiety. I hadn't spoken to my dad since the email exchange. My mom had been cagey, her texts short and perfunctory. Mark, ever the diplomat, had managed a few strained texts asking if I was okay. Okay? I felt like I'd been eviscerated. Walking into the familiar warmth of the sprawling suburban house, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon wafting through the air, felt like walking into a minefield. My dad greeted me with a booming, overly hearty embrace that felt more like a possessive claim than a welcoming hug. "Sarah, my girl, so good to see you," he boomed, his smile too wide, his eyes a little too intense. My mom hovered, her gaze darting between us, a familiar tension radiating from her. Mark, already nursing a glass of whiskey, offered a curt nod. The conversation, as always, revolved around him, his business, his latest deal, his vision for the future. He spoke of his challenges, his risks, his impending triumphs, all with the practiced ease of a seasoned orator. And then he turned to me.
"Speaking of fortunes," he said, his voice carrying through the dining room, now populated by the rest of the extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins. "Sarah here is doing so well. Such a responsible young woman. Always has been." He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be proud, but felt heavy, suffocating. "She's got a good head on her shoulders, understands the value of hard work." He paused, letting his words sink in, the subtle implication hanging in the air, and yet she's still learning. Then came the kicker, delivered with a perfectly innocent smile that made my stomach clench. "In fact," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the table, "she's been incredibly generous, letting me borrow some funds to help get this new venture off the ground. A young person like her, she has her whole life ahead of her. Doesn't need all that cash at once, does she?" A hush fell over the table. Faces turned towards me, some curious, some surprised, a few pitying. My Aunt Carol, bless her gossipy heart, leaned forward. "Oh, Sarah, that's so sweet of you. Your father must be so proud. How much did you lend him?" My throat tightened. I could feel a flush creeping up my neck, a heat that had nothing to do with the roaring fireplace. My carefully constructed facade, the one I'd maintained for years, was crumbling. I glanced at my mom, her eyes wide with panic, a silent plea for me to play along. Mark, for the first time that evening, looked genuinely uncomfortable, a flicker of something akin to guilt crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a shrug. But my dad, my father, was beaming, basking in the glow of his own perceived generosity, his own masterful spin. He'd framed it as my benevolence, my youthful idealism, my inherent understanding of his burdens. He hadn't just taken my money, he'd taken my narrative. He'd rewritten my sacrifice into his virtue. The humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. It wasn't just the public exposure of my financial vulnerability, but the implicit message that my autonomy, my hard-earned independence, was secondary to his needs, his ambitions, his ego. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up to declare the truth, to expose his manipulation for the predatory act it was. But the years of conditioning, of being the quiet, agreeable daughter, held me captive. My voice, when it finally came, was a strained whisper, barely audible above the crackling fire. It was a temporary arrangement. I managed, my voice betraying the tremor that ran through me. My dad patted my shoulder again, a proprietary gesture. "That's my girl," he said, his voice dripping with false pride, always so understanding. The silence that followed was deafening, a collective acknowledgement of the unspoken truth, the power imbalance that had always existed, and the new, brutal clarity of my father's exploitation. As I sat there, surrounded by my family, the forced smiles and polite conversation swirling around me, I felt an icy resolve begin to crystallize in the pit of my stomach. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but it was also a catalyst. Something inside me snapped. The quiet, compliant daughter was gone. In her place, a different kind of person was beginning to emerge. Someone who understood that sometimes, to reclaim what's yours, you have to stop playing by their rules. The rest of the dinner was a blur of forced smiles and hollow laughter. Every question, every comment felt like a spotlight aimed directly at my exposed nerve.
My aunt's innocent inquiries about my financial future, my uncle's unsolicited advice on investments, even my younger cousin's naive questions about how much I saved up for my job. It all felt like a deliberate, coordinated assault, orchestrated by my father's quiet, all-encompassing influence. He sat at the head of the table, the benevolent patriarch, occasionally interjecting with a proud comment about my maturity or my sensible approach to life, each word a subtle reinforcement of the narrative he'd so carefully crafted. He'd effectively neutered my ability to defend myself, painting any potential protest as ungratefulness, a childish refusal to acknowledge his greater wisdom. I excused myself early, claiming a headache, and retreated to the guest room, the silence of the empty house a stark contrast to the cacophony of forced pleasantries I'd just endured. I stared at my reflection in the antique vanity mirror, my eyes hollow, my face pale. The woman staring back looked defeated, a shadow of the confident professional I was in my everyday life. The $330,000 was gone. My pride was bruised. But in that moment, in the suffocating quiet of that familiar room, a different kind of fire began to flicker within me. It wasn't the hot, immediate rage I'd felt initially. This was something colder, something more deliberate. It was the dawning realization that my father, in his arrogance and his assumption of my weakness, had made a profound miscalculation. He had underestimated the power of a quiet life, the resilience of a wounded spirit, and the destructive potential of a daughter finally pushed too far. The money was gone, yes, but the lessons he'd inadvertently taught me about control, about manipulation, about the insidious ways families can both nurture and destroy, those were indelible. And as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The seeds of something much larger, much darker, had been sown that day. He had taken my money, but he had also gifted me with a clarity I'd never possessed before. The clarity of what he was capable of, and the clarity of what I was capable of doing in return. The drive back to the city felt different.
The usual dread was replaced by a strange, almost exhilarating sense of clarity. The anger hadn't dissipated entirely, but it had transmuted into something more potent, more focused. It was a quiet determination, a hardening of resolve that settled deep in my bones. I replayed the Thanksgiving dinner in my mind, dissecting every interaction, every glance, every carefully chosen word. My father's smug pronouncements, my mother's anxious silences, Mark's feigned indifference. It all painted a clear picture of the dynamics at play. I was the reliable daughter, the one who was expected to absorb the blows, to smooth over the rough edges, to always be the bigger person. My financial independence, so carefully cultivated, had been perceived not as a triumph of my own making, but as an overlooked resource, a buffer for his own financial recklessness. He hadn't just taken my money, he'd taken my adulthood and repurposed it for his own convenience. He had infantilized me in the most profound way possible by assuming I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I wouldn't care enough to push back. The sheer audacity of his claim that I owed him more after he'd already pilfered my life savings was almost laughable if it weren't so deeply insulting. It was the ultimate expression of his entitlement, a warped sense of familial obligation that placed his needs above all else. I realized then that the money itself was secondary. What had truly been violated was my trust, my sense of security, and my very identity as an independent adult. He had tried to reduce me to a mere extension of his own financial woes, a personal ATM machine he could tap into whenever he pleased. But I was more than that. I had built a life for myself, a career, a reputation, all through my own hard work and perseverance, and I was not going to let him dismantle it, not by stealth and not by decree. The emotional humiliation had been intense, a raw exposure that left me feeling raw and vulnerable, but it had also served as an unexpected awakening. It had stripped away the last vestiges of my naive belief in his inherent goodness and forced me to confront the manipulative core of his personality. The silence that followed his pronouncements at Thanksgiving wasn't just awkward, it was a collective acknowledgement of his power, a power he wielded through intimidation and subtle coercion. I had always been the one to break that silence with appeasement, with compromise. But now I understood that sometimes silence itself could be a weapon, a strategic withdrawal, a period of observation, a time to gather strength and formulate a plan.
The drive through the familiar cityscape, the neon lights blurring into streaks of color, felt like a transition into a different world. The world of my own making, where my decisions mattered, where my achievements were my own.
The world where I wasn't just Sarah, his daughter, but Sarah, the associate at a respected law firm, Sarah, the woman who could manage her own finances and build her own future. I parked my car in the usual spot, the familiar click of the lock a small, satisfying sound. Stepping into my quiet apartment, the air cool and still, I felt a sense of profound relief. The noise, the judgment, the suffocating expectation, it was all back there, a continent away. But the ache in my chest, the lingering sting of betrayal, was still present. It was a raw wound, but it was also a constant reminder of why I couldn't let this go. My father's casual theft had not just emptied my bank account, it had emptied the reservoir of my filial devotion. The trust had been irrevocably broken. He had acted with the unearned confidence of someone who believed they were beyond reproach, that their actions, however egregious, would be met with understanding and forgiveness, especially from their own children. He had underestimated my resilience, my capacity for strategic thinking, and my deep-seated need for justice. The sheer entitlement in his expectation that I would somehow owe him more after he'd already stolen from me was the final straw. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about reclaiming my autonomy, about asserting my right to my own life and my own future, free from his capricious control. I walked into my bedroom, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, and sat down on the edge of my bed. I looked at my hands, the hands that had worked late nights, that had meticulously tracked every dollar, that had built something solid and real. These were the hands that had been violated, and these were the hands that would begin to rebuild, not just my finances, but my standing. The humiliation had been a public spectacle, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to isolate and diminish me. But the silence that followed, the strategic withdrawal I'd initiated, was my own quiet rebellion. It was the first step in a long, deliberate process. He thought he had won. He thought he had asserted his dominance and extracted his due. But he hadn't seen the quiet storm brewing within me. He had created a problem for himself, a problem far more complex and enduring than a temporary financial shortfall. He had awakened a sleeping giant, and the consequences, I knew, would be far-reaching. The first few weeks after Thanksgiving were a study in calculated silence. I returned to my routine at the law firm, the polished mahogany desks and hushed conference rooms, a welcome contrast to the emotional minefield of my family home. My days were filled with legal briefs, client meetings, and the comforting, predictable rhythm of my professional life. It was a life I had built with my own two hands, brick and painstaking brick, and it felt blessedly separate from the tangled web of my family's affairs. I answered calls from my mother with a pleasant, even tone. Her anxious queries about my well-being met with reassuring, but ultimately vague responses. "I'm fine, Mom, just busy. Work is good. Lots of interesting cases." I deflected any questions about my father. Her hushed whispers of his latest business woes met with polite disinterest. "He'll figure it out," I'd say, the words feeling like smooth stones in my mouth. I didn't want to engage, not yet. I needed to gather my thoughts, to understand the full scope of the betrayal. He hadn't just taken my money, he had taken my trust, my sense of security, and he had done so with a chilling lack of remorse, disguising his greed as paternal generosity. My brother Mark was the only one I allowed myself to truly communicate with, albeit indirectly. He'd sent a terse text a few days after Thanksgiving, a simple, "Thinking of you, hope you're okay." It was weak, a perfunctory nod to the seismic shift that had occurred, but it was a start. I replied, "I will be," and left it at that. Mark was his father's son in many ways, eager for his approval, yet I sensed a flicker of unease in him that day, a shadow of doubt cast over his usual blind loyalty. He was the golden child, the heir apparent, but even he couldn't have missed the calculating glint in Dad's eyes when he declared my money was temporary. I figured he'd have his own theories about Dad's financial situation, his own insights into the failing business venture. He was part of that world, immersed in the same currents of ambition and risk that had led my father to this desperate act. Perhaps, I thought, he would eventually understand the depth of the manipulation, the sheer audacity of it. Or perhaps he would simply remain complicit, a silent observer in the unfolding drama. In the meantime, I dedicated myself to my work with an almost ferocious intensity. The legal world, with its intricate rules and predictable outcomes, offered a sanctuary. I reveled in the logic, the clear lines of right and wrong,
the ability to build a case, to dismantle an argument. It was a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of my family, where truth was a fluid, negotiable concept. I sought out cases that involved financial disputes, corporate malfeasance, anything that mirrored the betrayal I had experienced. It wasn't conscious revenge, not yet. It was more like a form of obsessive study, a way of dissecting the mechanisms of power and control that I felt had been wielded against me. I read through complex contracts, poring over balance sheets, tracing the flow of money with a laser focus. I learned about trusts, about shell corporations, about the intricate ways fortunes could be built, and perhaps more importantly, how they could be shielded or even siphoned.
It was during one of these late nights at the office, hunched over a particularly dense legal document related to an estate dispute, that I stumbled upon something that sent a jolt of icy realization through me. The document detailed the intricate network of trusts and holdings my father had established over the years, a labyrinth of legal entities designed ostensibly for estate planning and tax efficiency. It was standard practice for someone of his wealth, and I'd always assumed it was a sign of his shrewd business sense. But as I traced the flow of assets, cross-referencing it with publicly available filings and archived business news articles, a new picture began to emerge, one far more complex and disturbing than I had ever imagined. My father wasn't just a risk-taking businessman. He was a master architect of his own financial fortress, a fortress that seemed designed not just to protect his wealth, but to obscure it. I remembered my mother's hushed anxieties, her pleas for him to slow down, to diversify, to not put all his eggs in one basket. I'd always dismissed them as the worries of a homemaker, the anxieties of someone who didn't fully grasp the nuances of high finance. But now I saw a different story unfolding on the pages before me. The failing business venture wasn't just a desperate gamble. It was a carefully managed crisis, a predictable outcome that he had likely foreseen or even orchestrated. And the money he had taken from me, it wasn't just a desperate attempt to prop up a sinking ship. It was a calculated move, a way to inject liquidity into a system he was actively manipulating. The most shocking discovery came when I examined the trust documents related to his primary holding company. It was structured in a way that made tracing ownership incredibly difficult, a series of layers designed to obscure the ultimate beneficiaries. But through diligent cross-referencing and a deep dive into archived corporate records, I found a subtle yet undeniable pattern. A significant portion of the company's assets that were supposedly tied up in long-term investments and business operations, were channeled through a series of intermediary companies. And at the very end of this intricate chain, masked by a series of shell corporations registered in offshore jurisdictions, were the names of beneficiaries. Not just my father, and not just my mother, but also, quietly, almost imperceptibly, my name. My name. I stared at the digitized text, my breath catching in my throat. It was there, an undeniable fact woven into the fabric of his financial empire. It wasn't a large percentage, not enough to give me immediate control or obvious power, but it was there. A sliver of ownership, a right to a portion of the fortune he had so ruthlessly guarded. He had never mentioned it, not once. It was a secret he had kept, a contingency he had built into his financial architecture, perhaps as a safety net, or perhaps as a means of control. It was the ultimate irony. He had taken my money, believing me to be a dependent child incapable of managing my own affairs, and yet he had also quietly designated me as a beneficiary in his vast, opaque empire. The implications were staggering. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had built a system that, unbeknownst to me, included me. He had treated me as a disposable resource while simultaneously ensuring a future claim for me within his carefully constructed legacy. It was a perverse form of paternalism, a way of maintaining control even in his absence by dictating my inheritance. The humiliation I had felt at Thanksgiving, the feeling of being exposed and powerless, began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger that was far more potent. He had underestimated me. He had assumed my compliance, my docility, my inability to see beyond the surface. But I had seen, and now I knew. I spent the next few days immersed in the legal ramifications of my discovery.
I consulted with a trusted colleague, an older lawyer named David, who specialized in complex financial law. I presented him with the documents, not revealing the personal nature of my connection, framing it as a hypothetical scenario I was exploring for a fictional piece. David, ever the pragmatist, walked through the trusts with me, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is elaborate," he murmured, tracing a line on the printed documents with his finger. "He's got layers upon layers here, intentional obscurity. It's designed to make tracing assets incredibly difficult." He explained the concept of beneficial ownership, the legal complexities of offshore entities, and the potential avenues for challenging such structures, though he cautioned that it would be a lengthy and expensive process. "But Sarah," he said, looking up at me, his gaze sharp and knowing, "if you are indeed a beneficiary, even a minor one, with proper legal standing, you might have a right to request an accounting, a full disclosure of assets and liabilities. It's not a given, especially with these kinds of trusts, but it's a starting point." An accounting. The words resonated deeply. It meant a forensic examination of his entire financial empire, a deep dive into every transaction, every investment, every hidden account. It meant the truth laid bare. The power shift began to crystallize in my mind. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an architect of my own potential victory. He had built his fortress, but he had inadvertently left a key hidden within its walls. My father had always prided himself on his control, his ability to manipulate situations and people to his advantage. He had wielded his wealth as a weapon, subtly dictating the lives of his children, ensuring their dependence, their gratitude. But he had never anticipated that his own carefully constructed legacy might become the instrument of his undoing. The knowledge that I was a beneficiary, however obscured, changed everything.
It gave me a legal standing, a right to demand answers that he had always denied me. The humiliation of Thanksgiving had been the spark, but this discovery was the fuel. I began to feel a sense of calm descend over me, a quiet, unnerving composure that surprised even myself. The hot rage had cooled into a steady, burning ember of resolve. I started observing my father more closely, not with the affection of a daughter, but with the detached scrutiny of a prosecutor. I noticed the subtle shifts in his demeanor when certain topics arose, the way he would deflect questions about his business with practiced ease, the almost imperceptible flicker of unease in his eyes when the subject of my financial future came up. He was a man who lived by his wits, by his ability to control narratives, to spin every situation to his advantage. He believed he had won, that he had put me in my place, that my silence was a sign of my submission. He had no idea that I was already meticulously planning my next move, armed with knowledge he had desperately tried to conceal. One evening, during a seemingly innocuous phone call, my mother mentioned that my father was planning a large expansion for his business, acquiring a new manufacturing facility upstate. "He's so excited, Sarah," she'd said, her voice tinged with the familiar blend of pride and apprehension. "He says this is the deal that will finally turn everything around." I listened, my mind racing. A large expansion, acquiring a new facility. These were significant financial commitments. He was clearly still operating under the assumption that his financial resources were limitless, that he could continue to dip into whatever wells he pleased. The thought of him sinking more money, my money, into another precarious venture ignited a fresh wave of anger, but it was tempered by a growing sense of purpose. That night, I drafted a formal letter, a carefully worded request for an accounting of the trusts. I didn't send it immediately. I wanted to ensure I had every legal angle covered, every potential loophole identified. I spent hours researching probate laws, trust disputes, and the legal rights of beneficiaries. I was no longer just Sarah, the lawyer. I was Sarah, the claimant, the inheritor of a secret that could unravel everything. The following week, I received an unexpected email from Mark. It was brief, almost cryptic. "He's in trouble. Real trouble. Dad's asking for help. Big help." My heart leaped into my throat. Trouble. The kind of trouble that involved him asking for big help. It meant his carefully constructed empire was teetering, and he was ready to exploit any available resource. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the big help he was likely contemplating involved calling upon me, the responsible daughter, the one he had so callously exploited. He would expect me to bail him out, to once again sacrifice my own future for his ambition. But this time, the script had changed.
He had given me the knowledge I needed. He had shown me the path to reclaiming not just my money, but my dignity. The thought of him reaching out, of him expecting my unquestioning obedience, filled me with a chilling sense of anticipation. His desperation would be my leverage. His need would be my weapon. He had played his hand, and in his arrogance, he had revealed his most closely guarded secrets. Now, it was my turn to play. The game was far from over. It was just entering its most dangerous and most satisfying phase. The email from Mark landed in my inbox on a Tuesday afternoon, the stark white of the message a jarring contrast to the dense legal briefs I'd been poring over. He's in trouble. Real trouble. Dad's asking for help. Big help. No preamble, no elaborate explanation, just a raw, blunt assessment delivered with the efficiency of a telegram. It wasn't a plea for me to intervene, not directly, but the subtext was deafening. He was in deep, the kind of deep where he'd swallow his pride and reach for the lifeline he'd so carelessly severed. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, a ghost of the old urge to immediately reach out, to offer comfort, to mediate. But that Sarah was gone, buried somewhere beneath layers of disillusionment and a newfound, icy clarity. This Sarah saw Mark's message for what it was, a signpost, pointing directly to the precipice my father had been teetering on. Big help, indeed. He was expecting me, wasn't he? The responsible daughter, the one who always played by the rules, the one he'd conveniently overlooked in his grand financial schemes, only to later dip into her meticulously saved funds. He'd likely see it as a natural recourse, a daughter's duty to her father's sinking ship. A slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile, but one of dawning, exhilarating comprehension. He had built a fortress, but he had forgotten to reinforce the foundations. He had forgotten that some keys, buried deep within the labyrinthine structure, could unlock the entire edifice. He thought my silence after Thanksgiving was defeat, a cowering acceptance of his authority. He thought my continued silence for the past few months was simply me nursing my wounded pride, waiting for him to condescend to acknowledge my existence. He had no idea I'd been studying his blueprints, dissecting his methods, and discovering the one irrefutable truth that would dismantle his entire empire. I didn't reply to Mark, not yet. I let the email sit, a silent harbinger of the storm to come. Instead, I returned to the documents, to the intricate web of trusts and offshore shell corporations my father had so painstakingly constructed. David, my colleague, had been invaluable. He helped me navigate the complexities, explaining the fiduciary duties of trustees, the rights of beneficiaries, and the legal mechanisms for challenging opaque financial structures.
We'd spent weeks meticulously piecing together the puzzle, cross-referencing dates, names, and account numbers. He'd expressed a grudging admiration for my father's labyrinthine financial architecture, while simultaneously marveling at my persistence in unraveling it. Most people would have given up, he'd admitted, shaking his head. This is the kind of case that makes lawyers rich and clients miserable. The key, the one that would turn his fortress into rubble, was the fact that I was indeed a named beneficiary in one of his oldest and most complex trusts, the one that held the majority of his personal assets. It wasn't a dominant stake, not enough to give me unilateral control, but it was enough. Enough to demand an accounting, enough to legally pry open every locked vault, to scrutinize every transaction, to expose every secret. He had never told me, of course. Why would he? He preferred his children to be dependent, to be grateful for whatever crumbs he deigned to toss their way. My beneficiary status was a carefully guarded secret, likely intended as a failsafe, a way to ensure I remained tied to his legacy, even in death, rather than a source of immediate power. He had underestimated my ability to discover it, and more importantly, my willingness to use it. The day I officially filed the request for an accounting, a quiet sense of liberation washed over me. It was like shedding a heavy cloak of invisibility I hadn't realized I was wearing. The legal papers, filled with precise language and formal demands, felt like a shield, a tangible representation of my newfound strength. I had moved beyond the raw, burning anger. What remained was a cool, steady resolve, a deep-seated certainty that justice, in its own slow, legalistic way, was about to be served. I pictured my father's face, the smug assurance that had radiated from him at Thanksgiving, the condescending pat on the head. He had believed he was invincible, untouchable. He was about to learn the hard way that even the most fortified castles could be brought down from within. The first ripple of unease reached me through my mother. Her calls, once filled with gentle probing and veiled anxieties, now carried a distinct tremor of fear. "Sarah, your father is very stressed," she'd confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been getting a lot of calls, unpleasant calls from people I don't recognize." She didn't mention the specific nature of the calls, but I could fill in the blanks. The creditors were coming home to roost. The carefully managed crisis was spiraling out of control, just as he'd likely planned it would. Only this time, the safety net he'd woven for himself had holes in it, and those holes, I knew, led directly to me. A week later, the formal summons arrived. It wasn't delivered by a courier in a crisp suit, but by a rather stoic process server who appeared at my apartment door, a briefcase in hand.
The document was addressed to my father, to his primary business entity, and to the various trusts that held his wealth. It was my request for an accounting, now officially sanctioned by the court. I imagine the moment he received it was a turning point for him. The moment the game he thought he was controlling was suddenly taken out of his hands. The silence that followed for my family was deafening, a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of their demands and expectations. My mother stopped calling. Mark's sporadic texts ceased altogether. It was as if I had become radioactive, a pariah who had dared to challenge the established order. I imagined the hushed conversations happening behind closed doors, the panicked strategizing, the bewildered realization that their carefully constructed world was starting to crumble. He had always operated on the assumption of absolute control, and I had just demonstrated that his control was an illusion. Then he called me. It wasn't a call I'd been expecting, not directly. I'd anticipated him sending Mark, or perhaps his lawyers, to try and negotiate, to shame me, to bribe me, but it was him. His voice, when it came through the receiver, was raspy, strained, a shadow of its usual booming self. "Sarah," he began, the name itself a concession, a painful admission of my existence and my power. "We need to talk." I let him talk. I listened as he spun his usual tale of woe, of bad luck, of market downturns, my help. "The accounting. It's just a formality, Sarah, a bureaucratic hurdle. It doesn't mean anything. We can get through this together, like we always have." He was offering me a deal, a continuation of the old dynamic. He wanted me to withdraw the request, to let him continue his charade, and in return, he hinted at a future where my cooperation would be handsomely rewarded. "You've always been the smart one, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with insincere flattery. "You understand these things. You know how these financial matters work. We can work something out. A generous settlement." The word settlement hung in the air, a grotesque echo of the money he had taken from me. Generous? He had the audacity to offer me a generous settlement for the right to continue hiding his financial crimes from me and from the world. The calculated deception, the sheer arrogance of it all was breathtaking. I let a long silence stretch between us, allowing him to stew in his own desperation. I imagined him pacing his opulent office, his hands knotted, his mind racing for the right words, the right pressure points.
He had always been a master manipulator, but this time he was facing an opponent who understood the game far better than he did. Finally, I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, devoid of the emotional turmoil that was churning within me. "Dad," I said, the word feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue, "you asked me to talk, so let's talk. You took my money. You lied to me. You tried to make me feel like a child who didn't understand. And now you're asking me to trust you again, to let you continue to hide your financial dealings from me and from everyone else?" His breath hitched. "Sarah, that's not fair. I was trying to protect you." I laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Protect me? By draining my savings? By making me feel like a pawn in your games? No, Dad. You were trying to protect yourself, and you failed." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "The accounting is not a formality. It's the law. And I am a beneficiary of your trusts. That gives me rights, rights you clearly tried to deny me." He sputtered, his composure beginning to crack. "You think you can just expose me? Ruin everything we've built?"
You built it, Dad, I countered, my voice hardening. And you're the one who's ruining it. I'm just going to be there to document the process. I want what is rightfully mine, and I want the truth to be known. You've lived your life shrouded in secrecy and manipulation. It's time for that to end. He was silent for a long moment. I could almost feel him calculating, weighing his options. He knew he was cornered. He knew that his usual tactics wouldn't work on me anymore. The power had shifted, irrevocably. "What do you want, Sarah?" he finally asked, the question laced with a bitter resignation. "I want an honest accounting of all your assets and liabilities," I stated, my voice unwavering. "I want a full disclosure of every trust, every company, every transaction, and I want my rightful inheritance, the portion that was quietly designated for me years ago and the portion you so carelessly took. I'm not looking for revenge, Dad. I'm looking for what's mine, and I'm looking for the truth." He didn't reply. I could hear him breathing, a ragged, labored sound. I knew this conversation was likely the final nail in his carefully constructed coffin. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to orchestrate every aspect of his life and the lives of those around him. And I, his own daughter, had proven him wrong. I had broken free from his influence, not by shouting or by pleading, but by meticulously and quietly dismantling his world from the inside. The legal process that followed was grueling, exactly as David had predicted. It was a protracted, expensive, and emotionally draining affair. My father's lawyers fought every step of the way, employing every legal maneuver they could conjure to delay, obfuscate, and discredit. There were depositions, endless documents exchanged, and the constant, unnerving presence of legal teams dissecting every aspect of his financial life. Mark eventually surfaced, not to support his father, but to offer a hesitant, almost apologetic olive branch. He confessed that he'd known, or at least suspected, that their father's business had been in trouble for a long time. He'd seen the signs, the desperate measures, the increasingly opaque financial dealings, but he'd been too afraid to confront their father, too afraid of his disappointment, too eager to maintain his position as the favored son. His confession was a pale imitation of the truth I was uncovering, a small ember compared to the inferno of my father's deceptions. He asked if there was anything he could do, anything he could tell me that would help. I simply told him to be honest. That was all I wanted from any of them. My mother, caught in the crossfire of her husband's unraveling life and her daughter's quiet rebellion, was a broken woman. She pleaded with me to stop, to come home, to try and mend the family. But the family, as I knew it, had already fractured beyond repair. The foundation of trust, the bedrock of any healthy relationship, had been eroded by years of deceit and manipulation. As the legal proceedings wore on, the full extent of my father's financial machinations became horrifyingly clear. The failing business venture wasn't just a downturn. It was a carefully orchestrated collapse designed to siphon off assets into hidden accounts, to create the illusion of bankruptcy while millions were being squirreled away. Shell corporations, registered in jurisdictions with lax regulations, moved money in and out with dizzying speed. It was a masterclass in financial subterfuge, and the sheer audacity of it was almost breathtaking. The turning point came when a judge, tired of the endless delays and blatant obstruction, ordered a complete and transparent accounting of all assets. The resulting documents were a testament to my father's cunning and his desperation. They laid bare a network of offshore accounts, real estate holdings disguised under multiple layers of ownership, and investments that seemed to vanish into thin air. But through it all, the thread of my own beneficiary status remained, a beacon in the fog of his deceit. The day the final accounting was released, the courtroom was packed. My father sat beside his legal team, his face a mask of grim determination, but his eyes held a flicker of the defeat he was desperately trying to conceal. My mother sat in the front row, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly together. Mark was there too, his gaze fixed on the floor. As the judge read out the findings, detailing the vast sums of money that had been hidden, diverted, and concealed, a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The numbers were astronomical, far exceeding anything I had ever imagined.
But then the judge turned to me, her voice clear and firm.
"And Miss Vance," she said, addressing me directly, "you are a named beneficiary in Trust 7. The total value of your designated inheritance, according to this accounting, is substantial. Furthermore, the evidence clearly indicates that funds belonging to you, specifically, the sum of amount implied by story context, initially deposited into your savings account, were misappropriated and channeled into these trusts without your informed consent. The court orders full restitution of these misappropriated funds with interest and the immediate transfer of your designated inheritance, as detailed in the accounting." The words hung in the air, a death knell for my father's empire. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the pronouncement settling over everyone. Then I saw it. The flicker in my father's eyes had turned into a burning, desperate rage, quickly followed by a hollow resignation. His control, his legacy, his carefully constructed illusion of power had all crumbled before my eyes. He had lost everything. I didn't gloat. I didn't offer platitudes. I simply looked at him, my gaze steady and unwavering. He had underestimated me, believing my silence to be weakness. But my silence had been my strength. It had been the space where I'd gathered my resolve, where I'd learned his secrets, where I'd built my own fortress of truth and legal strategy. The aftermath was a slow, painful unraveling for my father. The legal penalties were severe. The reputation he had cultivated for decades was shattered. His business collapsed, and the vast wealth he had so desperately tried to hoard dissolved under the scrutiny of the courts and the demands of creditors. My mother, devastated but surprisingly resilient, eventually found a quiet life away from the wreckage of his ambitions. Mark, stripped of his expected inheritance and the privilege he had always taken for granted, was left to forge his own path, a path that would undoubtedly be far more challenging than the one he had been destined for. For me, it wasn't about the money, not entirely. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about proving to myself that I was not a pawn to be manipulated, but a force to be reckoned with. The legal process had been brutal, exposing the worst aspects of human greed and familial betrayal. But it had also been cathartic. It had purged me of the lingering resentment and the feelings of inadequacy that had festered for so long. Standing on the steps of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, I felt a profound sense of quiet victory. The money was mine. The truth was out. The cycle of manipulation and control was broken. It wasn't a triumphant fanfare, no grand celebration. It was simply the end of a very long, very dark chapter. A deep, cleansing breath filled my lungs. I had survived, and in surviving, I had finally, truly found myself.
The air felt lighter, cleaner, full of the promise of a future I would build, on my own terms, with a clarity and strength I never knew I possessed.